Okay, so let's just dive straight into this. God. So a bit of background first. So where am I coming from with this? I was raised in a Catholic household, although it was my grandparents who were Catholics and I was a couple of generations down. It was sort of a bit like the Waltons. There was sort of three generations living in that house, and as a child, I used to. I think I remember seeing my sort of uncles and aunties, and perhaps mother as well, sort of questioning some of the teachings. And so, I think because I'd seen that, I became suspicious as well. And I used to ask difficult questions as well. I remember coming back in the car, Granddad's Rover, I think it was, sort of asking why, if God was so good, he'd allow evil, and how could the universe be created out of nothing, and all this kind of stuff. So it was really mad questions for a kid. And in the end, I think for some reason I can't remember, but my mum said no. I think she sort of intervened and sort of stopped me attending the church and so on. But needless to say, I hadn't heard great things about it because many people in my family had been to Catholic church, not had great experiences. I've talked about this elsewhere, and so I got into maths and computers and physics, and a good friend of mine, Paul, we used to sit for hours discussing cosmology and space-time, light and gravity and all this stuff. And so I kind of ended up turning my back on sort of spirituality writ large, and certainly religion. And, then you get all this sort of bad press about the Catholic Church, and you just think, these guys are bloody evil, and they've got the Vatican City, it's full of gold, and the kind of general sort of narrative is that it's just not healthy. They've suppressed sort of certain human inclinations, which looks like some kind of patriarchal kind of control of female sexuality and so on, and it just doesn't look healthy, right? And it's become sick internally, and it seems to be about dogmatism. It's about sort of, hammering the truth into a tablet and saying, this is it, folks, this is the truth, this way or the frickin' highway, right? And so I just knew there was some intuition I had about this stuff. I just thought, this just can't be right, And why is it the case that all these guys in these other countries, they have their gods? And so, how do we know we're right? And just really, really basic childlike questions led to, plus all the cynicism surrounding me, just kind of led to me just thinking religion was absolutely daft. And so I threw myself in with the likes of Dawkins, Selfish Gene, the God Delusion, Blind Watchmaker. I was down with all of that. The central thesis of the Blind Watchmaker is that, whilst it looks, if we find a watch on a beach, I think this is the kind of metaphor he's hammering, is that if we find a watch on a beach, we automatically assume that there must have been some sort of designer, right? But the watch is not an emergent phenomena. You can see it's been machined and designed and assembled, right? It's mechanical. It's distinct from fleshy, warm stuff, right? And but he's saying that we've got a problem with that because we're builders and designers and stuff. We think in those ways. So when we look at nature, there's this tendency to think that it's been designed, and thus we end up becoming creationists or monotheists, right? Because I think they broadly, although these days, I'll get to this later, but it's ridiculous to say something like I disagree with Christians, or I don't like Christians, or I like Christians, because there's no single thing that is a Christian, right? I think every Christian I've ever spoken to has sort of at least subtly different metaphysics, morals, right? Kind of customs, practices, even within the same denomination, right? And, some of them are superstitious, some of them believe in ghosts, some of them think that anything spiritual that's outside of the sphere of Christianity is basically heretical. Some of them acknowledge the New Age scene, some of them are New Age Christian. There's just so many different flavours of Christian that it's ridiculous to kind of throw them into one bag. But anyway, let's just get back to my earlier feelings about the church. I didn't like the hierarchical sort of obvious power structures, the uniforms, the regimentation of the whole thing. You probably felt elsewhere that I'm no fan of regimentation, but I can see that it may have served some cultural or community function, right? I get that, and there's a huge complex history to the church, and it's brought some many benefits, and they preserved much in the way of scientific knowledge as well. It mustn't be forgotten. So astronomers were born out of monasteries, and beer makers, which will please many people. We have the monks to thank for for ale and mead and all this sort of stuff, and certainly the commercial production of stuff. And I think some still do, right? And so, sorry, I don't know. That's a bizarre kind of foray to explore there. But look, the thing is that it's become some kind of business, some kind of army. They've become sort of nations of the soul, right? And even like I say, even most children go through this phase of saying, well, hang on a minute, why do we know our God's right and their God's wrong? And that's just the core problem, isn't it? The dogmatic insistence on submission to this higher authority, and then the church using that divine sort of authority to command their flock, to do as they're told, and to confess, and to feel ashamed of their sexual sort of urges and stuff, even though they're freaking warm-blooded mammals that can never ever do away with some of these instincts, perhaps except after millions of years of continued evolution in totally different direction. But I just think it's such a a core feature of the human animal that to try to suppress it is foolhardy and dangerous, and we've seen the results of it, right? So yeah, I didn't see them as a good crowd. I mean, and then I had a few sort of fairly surreal experiences. I was really into heavy metal as a sort of 14 through to sort of 16, 17-year-old. I still quite like it now, right? And I was into Iron Maiden and Black Sabbath and all these kinds of Judas Priest and stuff. And my girlfriend's mother used to force me to leave these heavy metal records in the milk box outside. Even in winter, I was terrified that they would degrade because of the weather or something. But I'd leave them out there for a few hours while I saw Becky, and I'd smuggle tapes in, so we could listen to it. and because she felt that it was the devil's work, right? And so, madly, for some reason, she invited us to go along to this church, and I think Becky's younger sister used to go. So Becky and I kind of somehow got, coerced into going. Well, not coerced, but sort of nudged into going. We thought, it might be a laugh. But then, just out of the blue, we met all these other heavy metal guys there, like Adi and Steve and Bones, and these characters that we then became really, really good friends with and hung around with, went to gigs with, and drank excessively with. And so it was funny that but what were we doing there? We were all walking around with kind of satanic symbols on our back patches, and Black Sabbath, all this kind of stuff. And yet there we were at a born-again evangelical Christian church. Now, I had an experience there, right? They were saying this kind of prayer. It was to do with kind of harvesting souls and saving those that had given their lives to Jesus, and those that hadn't would be left to rot, actually. And that's hell kind of thing, They said hell isn't, I think one of them said that hell wasn't a specific place. It was just, hell was just not being admitted into the house of the Lord. Anyway, they were saying this big prayer, and like, those of you that haven't been saved, and I was very conscious of the fact that I was unsaved, or, pretty much turned my back on it. I used to argue with my granddad, which I regret. And they said those that hadn't been saved, i.e. me, start raising your hand. And I looked around and saw a few other people's hands raising. And then, lo and behold, my hand started raising just on its own. And it was just like, what the hell? I looked at it as if to say, get down, get down. I don't want to do this, right? And then I but there was loads of chanting. There were people around me talking in tongues, kind of that kind of thing. And there were people collapsing. So anyway, my hand raised up, and then the preacher guy, who was just, he had it was corny in the extreme. He looked like one of these American televangelists, right? He had sort of like blue suit and a big fat sort of 70s tie and sideburns, and the guy used to drive off in a white Mercedes, And him and some of his associates looked very coined, shall we say. And he said, yes, those of you come forward, and he sort of gestured at me, and I kind of shuffled forward, and then he started putting his hands on other people, and everyone's head that he put the hand on, they collapsed. They just collapsed to the ground, and some of them were crying and all this kind of stuff. And I didn't collapse, right? And there was almost a sort of, oh my God, what the hell am I doing? Kind of I felt slightly embarrassed. I was a 16-year-old lad, shouldn't be doing stuff like this. It's totally uncool. But anyway, then those of us that were kind of, blessed or touched or whatever by this televangelist lookalike, we were kind of summoned into this back room, and I was thinking to myself, so am I half saved then? Because I lifted my arm up like everybody, but then I didn't collapse. And I was already just sort of cracking jokes in my own sort of inner space about this stuff. And then we were taken through to this room. They asked for our names and addresses. Phone numbers, didn't have mobiles at this stage, believe it or not. This is 36 years ago, right? And then, I went away, and I never went back after that. And it was strange, because there were people, it tended to be ladies would come up to me and say, oh, you look very strong in the eyes of Christ, and I can see the Holy One is with you, and, and they said my blue eyes were dazzling and stuff. And I thought, oh, I like this. I think that was one of the reasons I went back for a while. So I had this experience. I had several other experiences in my childhood as well. I think I've mentioned this elsewhere, if anyone cares to listen to some of this stuff, that I used to go into these just automatically, randomly, without knowing what was coming, go into these kind of very gentle sort of trance-like states, right? There was one particular occasion, I think it happened to me about sort of, it's very fuzzy in childhood, probably sort of 5 or 6 times, I reckon, maybe more. I had sort of gentle dalliances with it here and there, but there were 5. I would say there was 5 or 6 times where I went quite deep. And when I went quite deep, all I can say about this was that it was just extremely calm. I had no body. There was there were these shifting pastel clouds in this kind of just extensive space. It felt, there was no limit to it. So I suppose you might say it sort of felt infinite, but there was just, it still felt like I was surrounded, and I felt like I was in something, right? But the space didn't have any boundary. And there were just these sort of pastel sort of blues and pinks and soft yellows and things like that, and just slowly evolving and shifting and stuff. No body, no logic, right? No language of any sort. This is why it's kind of hard to explain. But then invariably, and it always ended this way, these dark objects would start appearing, kind of everywhere. It would start sort of small, and this structure would emerge, and it was kind of like a ball of nails or sort of paper clips or something like that. But if you zoomed in, you could see that it was made up of these infinite variety of objects, human designed objects, ladders, chairs, TVs, telephones, people, dogs, prams, just endless variety of these different objects all tangled up together, and it would become overwhelming. And I think, on reflection, I think I was putting them there, and I was putting them into position and helping to assemble them within this mass, right? But I couldn't stop doing it, right? And that was sort of slightly maddening in a way, and that I'd sort of freak out a bit and pull out. It wasn't terrifying, but it would suddenly shock me into the realization that I was no longer sort of at peace, right? And that's when I'd come out of the trance. So there was this one occasion, I was forever forgetting where I'd left things and losing things as a kid. I wasn't allowed to have keys and stuff, and so it was 10 to 12 or something. And they called me the absent-minded professor. I spent half my life just looking through insect and animal encyclopedias, particularly interested in ants and so on. And I would just kind of enter into, because maybe it's just only child syndrome, because I was an only child until I was 11, when my little brothers started turning up, and my sister. And so, I was very good at entertaining myself, right? And I would just be in these little projects that I had going, where I was studying ants, I was counting them over periods of time, looking at where they were going, mapping their nests and the exit points and all this kind of stuff. And I was absolutely fascinated by ant mating season. I just thought it was just unbelievable. I'll never forget these horrible lads down the road. I won't name them because I wouldn't shame them. But I remember them being out there with badminton, tennis rackets, smacking all these mating ants in the air, just killing them, cruelly and needlessly. And that drove me mad. I was really upset about that. And so I would be inside these projects for days on end, just making notes, scribbling diagrams and all this kind of stuff. And so when people ask me to do things or get things or retrieve things, and it'd be like, it'd be bothersome, right? And I'd forget about the real world and all the practical necessities, like getting up and going to school, or doing my homework and all this sort of stuff, because I was so ensconced within these private realities, right? And so I think maybe that's why I sort of lent towards some of these trance-like experiences, perhaps it at least sort of opened the door or made it ajar or something. And so there was this one occasion where they said, "Oh, Matthew, can you go and get your something or other?" I think it might have been a towel. I think I'd left a towel somewhere in my bedroom, and it might be. And they said, "Can you go and get it?" And then I got upstairs, and I'd forgotten what it was they'd sent me for. Right, and they used to take the mick out of me sometimes, sort of, "Oh, you forgot, you bloody idiot," And so then I got upset because I thought I'm going to have to go downstairs and embarrass myself by asking yet again what it was they asked me to get, right? And so I sat down on the bed and I was a little bit sort of upset, and I withdrew at that point. And that's when I think that was the first time. That's when this kind of shifting pastel cloud space thing occurred, right? So just to cut a long story short, I'd had some mystical experiences. Or at least, what I'd say, inexplicable experiences. There was one occasion where a sort of child-sized shadow figure opened my bedroom door and leaned its head and looked round. Right now, as a grown-up, I'm thinking, well, surely that must have been a family member. But at the time, I was pretty smart. Right, I was quite precocious, really. And I did the thinking, and I asked my mother the following day. I said, "Did you check in on me last night?" She said, "No." Right, and there was no one that size living in the house. I was the only child in the house. This figure was about my size. I was like 8 or 9, right? And so and I used to have. I started lucid. I had a few lucid dreams, sort of 10 or 11, and I've had quite many since. Not so many not for a long time. And so I'm no stranger to these kind of what could be described as sort of transcendent experiences, right? Where you somehow sort of leave the trappings of the standard personality behind, right? And there's this kind of there's this sense in which you think, I kind of remember this. A lot of people that do DMT, which I haven't done, right? I mean, I'm sort of a little bit sort of scared about it, really. I might do one day, but I've got to pay the bills and so on, right? But they report this feeling of familiarity, and I've had that when I've done lucid dreaming. There's these two particular entities, right? I don't know what they are. I'm not saying they necessarily exist out there in inverted commas, right? But there are these two entities that I encountered. There was one. My ex-wife showed me how to. She did this kind of transcendental meditation and astral meditation. She used to leave her body and stuff. She claimed. I was quite scientific at the time, so I used to question and interrogate her about it, which she didn't mind. It was quite an interesting investigation, right? But she explained this process of relaxation. It was a bit kind of yogic, and then you kind of meditate, you stop thinking, normal kind of stuff. But then you do have that. She said you need this kind of backward pull almost. It's like there's this act where you pull at your presence and you pull it out the back of your head, and it seemed to sort of work. And I went out of my body, but I didn't go anywhere that I recognised. It wasn't like I was astrally projecting in the standard sense where you can see towns and cities and forests and stuff, which I have done in lucid dreaming, interestingly. And this was more I was in darkness, right? But it wasn't. There was activity going on in the background, sort of little wisps and movement and chattering and sort of agency of some sort. There were entities there, right? But I didn't feel there was no fear. I was completely at ease. And then I came upon what felt like a desk, right? Like a sort of standard physical wooden desk. And I was sat there at this desk, and there were these two characters there, and there were like a couple of old... The only way I could... If I was going to have to wrap a visual characterisation around them, I'd say there were a couple of old, grumpy old sort of insurance brokers, right? Something like that. I'd imagine them with suits on and being doddery and but eccentric and deeply intelligent and wise, right? And one of them sort of was quite irked when I arrived. Zoomed into this sort of desk position, just facing them, thinking, "Who the hell are they?" And I couldn't really see them, make them out in the standard sense, right? But they knew they were there, and again, I felt a certain kind of familiarity with them. And more recently, I've encountered them as well. So yeah, again, sort of, I'm going into quite a lot of detail here, but all of this is enough to show that I admit I'm happy to talk about mystical, spiritual experiences. So I'm just going to pause.